Audio Lecture Unit 3, Classical Age Asia, China and India. Classical Age China. We're going to start by talking a little bit about the Zhou Dynasty. The Zhou Dynasty comes to power in 1122 BC and rules for 900 years. It is the longest dynasty in China's history. It lasts until 256 BC. So in actuality, Zhou Dynasty starts before the classical period, 600 BC. But we are covering it now because it leads us into the classical period in the midst of it. The Zhou Dynasty developed a new theory of statecraft, the mandate of heaven. Now, we've discussed this before in earlier lectures when we've been talking about Chinese society. So this will be a little bit of a review from stuff we've covered before. Heaven, if you recall, in the mandate of heaven, is not a god, but an impersonal, creative force of nature that kept order in the universe through the Zhou king or emperor. An intermediary between heaven and earth was how the emperor was viewed. The authority to rule was given to him by heaven, the mandate. The king was chosen to rule based on his talent and his virtue, but the king must rule well with the Tao. The Tao means the way. If not, he could be overthrown. And this, my friends, is a very big deal. A right of revolution among these early peoples is unheard of. The idea of the right to rebel if a king does not act properly really doesn't come along in the Western part of the world until constitutional monarchy is created in the late 17th century in England. The dynastic cycle, we looked at this already before as well, just a review for you. If you need to go over it carefully, you can pause the video right now to look at it. Otherwise, I'm going to move forward since we've covered it already. Unfortunately, the later Zhou emperors mismanaged their empire. There was a series of bad emperors towards the end of the Long Dynasty, this longest dynasty in Chinese history. And it ultimately led to division among the people in a period known as the period of the Warring States. This, of course, will also lead to a division of power between different noble families in different parts of China. So instead of there being one united China, there was a division in different warring states. It is during the Warring States period that we see the rise of Confucianism. Confucius was living through this period of chaos, and this disorder will help to influence him on ways to think about how rulers could rule better and keep such chaos from happening. This disorder will last for several generations until the mandate of heaven is restored and the dynasties return to China. The Qin Dynasty, 221 to 206 BC. It's a short-lived dynasty, but a very powerful one. The Qin Dynasty united China for the first time in centuries under Emperor Qin Shihuangdi, the first emperor. Now, this is a time that you see China being united, meaning larger portions of China than we have ever seen before, united under one ruler, even larger than the Zhou Dynasty had control over. Qin Shihuangdi referred to himself as the first emperor as a result of that. A quote about Qin Shihuangdi and his rule. A new age is inaugurated by the emperor. Rules and measures are rectified, the myriad of things set in order. Human affairs are made clear, and there is harmony between fathers and sons. The emperor, in his sagacity, benevolence, and justice, has made all laws and principles manifest. Caring for the common people, he works day and night without rest. He defines the laws, leaving nothing in doubt, making known what is forbidden. The local officials have their duties. Administration is smoothly carried out. All is done correctly, all according to plan. The emperor, in his wisdom, inspects all four quarters of his realm. Qin Shihuangdi centralized the government, ending what had been the feudal system in China. And he ordered the nobles, then, that had been in control of those warring states, to move to his new capital city so he could control them and they could not challenge his authority. Keep your friends close, keep your enemies closer. He also worked very diligently to stabilize the economy in China. He initiated a system of standardized measurements and writings, and he created national coins that could be exchanged throughout all of China. He also worked diligently to repair the roads and the canals to make trade move more smoothly. All of these things will benefit trade in the long run and benefit all of China, making the economy stronger once again. Shihuangdi also ordered small walls built by the warring states period rulers to be united and connected into what will eventually be the Great Wall of China, symbolizing the unification of China. Now, this will begin under his reign, but the building of the wall actually continues for several generations later. In fact, even into later dynasties, we will see it be extended upon. But the beginning of the Great Wall of China will be done by Qin Shihuangdi. This was largely to keep those nomadic marauders that lived to the north of those living in China out. These marauders were known as the Zhuangyu, but they were really predecessors to the Mongols. The Great Wall of China is 5,500 miles long now. Remember, this will not all be built during one dynasty. Shihuangdi was a harsh ruler, however. Case in point, this building project was forced labor, and many people will die in the process of building this wall. Many bones would be buried under the wall as it was being built. So sometimes the Great Wall of China is referred to as the world's longest graveyard. Shihuangdi also adopted a new form of governing, a new political philosophy known as legalism. Legalism was very much what we normally will call today the end justifies the means. Whatever one needed to do to achieve a stable and strong state was okay as long as that goal was achieved, which oftentimes meant ruling harshly, ruling unfairly, or even using manipulation and deceit to get what you want. Shihuangdi also charged very high taxes. He had to maintain his armies as well as to maintain the building projects, like the wall. The forced labor and mandatory military service were all part of this process, but it created a great deal of resentment towards his authority in the long run. When Shihuangdi died, rebellions began, and it actually led to an end of the Qin Dynasty. This dynasty, in other words, really isn't a dynasty because it only lasted for one ruler. But Qin Shihuangdi was wanting to make sure that his remains remained safe under the watchful eyes of his armies when he died. So he built a full-size terracotta army of soldiers who were life-sized, and he had them buried with him to protect him in the afterlife. Now, yes, these are representations of his armies. Obviously, they're not real people, but the idea was that they could help protect his spirit in the afterlife. He had the entire army buried underground with himself, and he did not allow any of the people to know where he was buried. In fact, the builders who worked on this project were kept in secrecy. Some of them were probably killed as well. And this terracotta army will be lost, as well as the burial place of Qin Shihuangdi, for many hundreds of years. It will be discovered in the 1970s. The Qin Dynasty only lasted 14 years, but the legacy is clear. It united China under Qin Shihuangdi's harsh rule. His harsh rule allowed for the economy to be stabilized with the different economic reforms that he put in place: the standardized weights and measurements, the coinage system, the common currency system, road repairs and canal repairs, as well as the building of the wall, which will keep China safe for centuries from those outside invaders. If it had not been for Qin's harsh rule under legalism, the Han Dynasty, which comes next, would probably not have been able to achieve the great power and wealth that it did. So, there is a benefactor, I guess you would say, to the harsh rule of the Qin Dynasty, the Han Dynasty. So now let's talk about the Han Dynasty. In 206 BC, Liu Bang, also known as Zhou, became emperor, maintaining the centralized government that the Qin dynasty had established, but ending the harsh aspects of Qin rule. He will establish this dynasty so his successors will be able to be even more successful and make more advancements, technologically and otherwise. Probably the most famous of the early Han emperors, after Liu Bang, is Emperor Han Wudi. As a matter of fact, the dynasty ultimately is named after him, even though Liu Bang founded it. Emperor Han Wudi made China a Confucian state. Education, he thought, would be used as a tool to prepare people for bureaucratic work in the government. He wanted to make sure that his bureaucrats that would work under him were educated well in the Confucian ideology and the Confucian system. So he established a set of kind of government schools where people would study Confucian principles, and if they passed a civil service exam, they could be placed in a position in the government. The government workers had to pass this difficult civil service exam with extensive Confucian content. This was no easy feat, and it would not allow for very many to really be considered part of the government. However, it was an avenue for people who could show their talent through their education, through their intellect, to achieve high positions in Chinese society. You did not have to be wealthy to be a bureaucrat. However, you did have to find some way to pay for the schooling, so it helped to be wealthy. This is part of what we call a meritocracy in China, meaning those who prove themselves to be the best for the job will be the ones that get the job. Meritocracy. Government officials were expected to respect their superiors and model good behavior to their inferiors. This is how filial piety, which had been a concept in Chinese culture for centuries, would be incorporated into the governing system during the Han Dynasty. Confucian principles, along with filial piety from the ancient Chinese, creates government officials that rule for the benefit of the citizens in the state. It's not a democracy, but it is a meritocracy. Confucian scholars held privileged positions in society and felt it was their duty to criticize the emperor if he took a wrong path. This is an interesting thing because very few emperors will put up with such criticism, as you can imagine. But this will oftentimes be a way to determine if a ruler is good or bad. If he's ruling with Confucian principles, his bureaucrats will be happy and good and rule in his name well. The Han era society was rigidly hierarchical, meaning a strict caste system or class system was developed. And Confucianism emphasized that patriarchy, as we know. We know that the men were valued more than women, but we also know through Confucianism that there were 5 key relationships, and everyone had a duty to everyone else. If everyone performs their duty in society to the best of their abilities, society will run smoothly. This goes all the way to the top, to the emperor himself. Confucian scholars considered farmers and artisans far more honorable than even the middle-class merchants. As a matter of fact, when you look at a social pyramid for China in the classical period, you will see that farmers and artisans, people who make something, who produce something that is useful for all of society, are actually the true middle class, and the merchants are the lower class, because the merchants do not make anything. They just sell and trade things that other people make or grow. Merchants, as I said, were less respected. They were sometimes seen as taking advantage of shortages to make profits. Y'all remember talking about scarcity during the geography phase of this course. But a large merchant class will emerge in Han China because business started to boom, largely because of the extension of the Silk Roads. It's a big trade network between the East moving westward that we'll talk about later on in this lecture. The government controlled iron and salt industries. So the government determined how much iron would be smelted and how much salt would be mined, rather than it being free enterprise. This extra revenue for the government allowed the Han to ultimately keep taxes low, since they controlled the iron and salt industries. And the Han Dynasty will ultimately produce some of the best iron that the world had ever seen. As a matter of fact, it'll be the best iron that the world will see until the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century, or in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Chinese metalworking was extensive. Just like we've talked about before, we are now in the Iron Age. Iron has replaced bronze for tools and weapons. It's much stronger. The Han Chinese also developed a new technology, making paper from wood. Also, they created another thing to help with farming, the wheelbarrow, as well as the fishing reel. The rudder on ships would help it steer. All of these are new technological advances that the Han invent. These are all very valuable tools that will eventually spread westward along the trade routes of the Silk Roads. The wheelbarrow and the rudder to steer ships in particular will be things that will be shipped westward. And as we will see, eventually they will be adopted and adapted by other cultures. They also developed, the Han Chinese also developed acupuncture. When it comes to medicine and how to keep somebody healthy, they did a lot of experimenting with different techniques. And they came up with acupuncture, finding pressure points on the body. And if you pushed on those pressure points, you could relieve pain in the body. They also came up with many herbal remedies, which would be forerunners to medicines that we see later on. And even they invented anesthesia to numb parts of the body while that part of the body would be sometimes operated on even. So the Han Chinese did a lot of developments in the medical field as well. Crafts workers in the Han Dynasty created jade and ivory carvings that became highly desirous all throughout the East and moving westward along the trade routes. They also had bronze art, ceramics, very fine ceramics, porcelain will be developed in the Han Dynasty, and also silk, of course. The cultivation of silkworms to make silk, some of the finest in the world. That's the reason why the trade routes are known as the Silk Roads. The ceramics become so well made in China during the Han Dynasty that eventually, as the world comes into contact with this pottery through the Silk Roads, it becomes such a hot commodity that pottery starts being referred to by many as China, as it still is very much so today, at least plates and those things. China became also a military powerhouse under the Han Dynasty, especially under Emperor Han Wudi. Han Wudi conquered all of Central Asia, Mongolia, Korea, and Vietnam, extending China to be the largest empire that had been seen in Asia up to that point. A tribute system allowed the conquered states to retain a bit of independence. As long as they paid their tribute or their taxes to the Han Emperor, he pretty much let them govern themselves, in exchange also for other gifts and goods that they might need, especially when it came to trade. In 184 AD or CE, so now moving forward past beyond the BC time period, okay? So we've moved forward, now crossing over into AD or CE time period. A series of weak rulers and unrest, fueled by landlords, their exploitation of their farmers, ultimately, led to what is known as the Yellow Turban Rebellion. This was led by Taoists. They were the ones who started this process. The Taoists had seen that these emperors, these late Han emperors, were becoming corrupt. And so they, even though normally Taoists are passive, as we know from studying the world religions, things must have been pretty bad and pretty corrupt in the government for them to take action and instigate the Yellow Turban Rebellion. By 220 AD or CE, if you don't have anything after it, you assume that it's AD, the age of division began in China as the Han Dynasty collapsed, and military leaders instead divided China into 3 separate kingdoms. Landowners in these 3 smaller kingdoms held most of the power in absence of a central government. And ultimately, we will have some trouble with the Huns. The Huns invaded China by going around the Great Wall. Anybody ever seen Mulan? That's what's going on. She was part of one of those other separate kingdoms, the Wei Kingdom, and the Huns invaded by going around the Great Wall. Now let's talk about Classical Age India. We're going to start by talking about the Mauryan Empire. Sometimes it's just called the Maurya Empire. First, the Persians and then Alexander the Great had conquered parts of the Indus River Valley. We'll talk about those in a different lecture. But just so you know, that had happened prior to the creation of the Mauryan Empire. In 323 BC, a man named Chandragupta Maurya united the clans of northern India and defeated the Seleucid dynasty, the Persian dynasty that had taken over northern India, to take the Indus River Valley for himself. Chandragupta Maurya was the first ruler of the East to conquer a western state, the Punjab region, that had been under the control of the Persians and then under the control of the Hellenistic Greeks after Alexander had conquered the Persian Empire. Chandragupta Maurya and his descendants created the Maurya Empire. This is seen as the first united Indian empire, where the subcontinent is united as one. The empire was organized into provinces, districts, and villages, with Chandragupta's allies and family members serving as leaders in most of them. The Mauryan Dynasty also established a well-organized, centralized government with a bureaucracy to help the emperors govern. The bureaucracy is a system of managing government through departments run by appointed officials. As stated in the previous slide, most of those officials were family members of the Mauryans. Chandragupta Maurya was actually seen, however, as a pretty harsh ruler. He mistrusted everyone, so he used a secret police force to help him keep tabs on his empire. And he also had built up a powerful army to crush any dissent in his empire. He had originally used this army, of course, to defeat the Seleucus kingdom that had taken over that northern India. And then he will use it to keep dissent at a minimum within his empire. Government is the science of punishment, Chandragupta Maurya was said to have claimed. The government controlled the economy as well. They had the idea that the land was basically owned by the state, and 1/4 of all crops were collected as taxes. Food production increased, however, under the Mauryan Dynasty, with irrigation projects and crop rotation being established, as well as trade flourishing. So the economy will eventually start to soar as a result. This will allow for major building projects to happen during the Mauryan Dynasty. The Mauryan capital of Pataliputra was a heavily defended city with big, heavy city walls and a citadel. It's amongst the largest cities of the classical age in the world. In 269 BC, Chandragupta was succeeded by his grandson, Ashoka. Sometimes you'll see Ashoka spelled without the H. Ashoka, or Asoka, as he's sometimes called, initially was as violent and brutal as his grandfather had been. But that will change shortly into his rule. After conquering Kalinga, he rejected the horrors of war and ultimately converted to Buddhism from Hinduism. By converting to Buddhism, Ashoka started to rule with compassion and nonviolence, because of course that was part of the Buddhist tradition. Nonviolence, get rid of desire, establish peaceful relations, etc. A quote that is attributed to Ashoka: "What a dreadful deed I have done. I was the head of a vast empire, but I longed to subjugate or take over a small kingdom and caused the death of thousands of soldiers. I widowed thousands of women and orphaned thousands of children. 150,000 people were taken prisoners. 100,000 were killed during the battle. Many more died as a result of the war. This was the conquering of Kalinga, and it made him think, and he felt ashamed. This is when his conversion moment happened." God took the strength of a mountain, the majesty of a tree, the warmth of a summer sun, the calm of a quiet sea, the generous soul of nature, the comforting arm of night, the wisdom of the ages, the power of the eagle's flight, the joy of a morning in spring, the faith of a mustard seed, the patience of eternity, the depth of a family need. Then God combined these qualities. When there was nothing more to add, he knew his creation was complete, and then he called it Ashoka. You can see the hymns to Ashoka show how his reign changed to be one of benevolence. All men are my children, he said. I am like a father to them. As every father desires the good and the happiness of his children, I wish that all men should be happy always. Ashoka was even dedicated to spreading Buddhism, feeling that just like it had brought peace to India, it could bring peace to the world. So because of the trade routes, especially that Silk Road's trade routes, as well as the Indian Ocean trade network that was controlled by India and other parts of Asia, we will see the spread of Buddhism. As a matter of fact, Buddhism will become more popular outside of India than it was in India in the long run. Buddhism expanded from a small Indian sect to a widespread belief system, ultimately, as a result of this spread that had been initiated by Ashoka along the trade networks. Ashoka issued his edicts on rock pillars throughout India. These rock pillars marked the path to holy sites to celebrate the life of the Buddha, the original Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, the one who started the religion back in the earlier classical period, around 500 BC. You see a number of rock pillars throughout India on this map. Ashoka was tolerant also of other religions. He brought peace and prosperity over his diverse people. By being tolerant, especially of the Hindu faith, which was still the main faith in India, it allowed for a more peaceful rule. He said, "No one should think that he and his religion are the greatest. All religions preach the same virtues, just as it is bad to indulge in self-praise and slandering others. It is bad to condemn other religions. Respect for other religions brings glory to one's own religion." In 232 BC, Ashoka died, and the Mauryan Empire fell into decline. H.G. Wells, British historian, wrote, "Amidst the tens of thousands of names of monarchs that crowd the columns of history, their majesties and graciousness, and serenities and royal highnesses, and the like, the name of Ashoka shines and shines, almost alone, a star." By 185 BC, Brahmin priests, the highest of the castes in the caste system, led a revolt and assassinated the last Mauryan emperor. India would be divided and chaotic for the next 500 years, not united as one kingdom for 500 more years. Until we reach the Gupta Empire in India. As I said, 500 years later, around 320 AD or CE, the Gupta Empire emerged on the Ganges River and eventually moved southward, conquering most of northern India to about the midpoint of the subcontinent. The Gupta Empire is a golden age in Indian history. Even though it might not have been as large as the Mauryan Empire, it was very strong. Golden age. It will have a united society, the arts will flourish, and the economy will thrive. That is basically the definition of a golden age in any civilization. A united society, meaning peaceful, ruled well, arts flourishing, which also includes science and education, and the economy thriving. The Gupta emperors established a political structure similar to the Mauryans, but they never had as large an amount of territory or as centralized as the Mauryan emperors had 500 years before them. The Gupta bureaucracy was smaller than the Mauryans. They relied more on local authorities to maintain order and to collect taxes and tributes. They hoped that they would maintain control over these areas by acting in a benevolent way, allowing self-governance in those areas as long as they paid their taxes. Rulers outside of the administrative center of the empire, however, over time became corrupt and even more powerful. Because the Gupta emperors lacked absolute power, like the Mauryans had had, they ultimately will lose control over many of these areas of their empire to those other bureaucrats who were under them. The Gupta, however, controlled the trade of salt and metals. They taxed the farmers 1/4 of all the products and forced labor on state projects. Joint families were common, with parents, children, grandparents, uncles, and their children all sharing a common home. Now, of course, this picture is more modern day, but it's showing you a joint family that's still common to this day in India. The untouchables, the lowest caste in India, lived very harsh lives under the Gupta Empire. They lived separately and were given the worst or impure jobs. The Guptas ultimately returned India to Hinduism. And remember, Hinduism recognizes the caste system as important, whereas Buddhism rejected the caste system. One of the reasons why the Mauryan Empire had become so was seen as so benevolent is because they had let go of the caste system by becoming Buddhists. That will change again once we reach the Gupta Empire. It's still a very patriarchal society dominated by men. Women actually lost some rights in the Gupta Empire in India that they had gained during the Mauryan Empire. The Gupta emperors encouraged the arts, however. That's why we have a golden age during this time period. Poetry and literature were highly appreciated during this era, and we see lots of advancements being made in the arts. We also see that Indian mathematics developed a huge advancement during the Gupta Empire. Indian mathematicians developed the concept of zero and the decimal system. Ultimately, this will lead to the creation of what we now sometimes refer as Arabic numerals, but in reality, they're Indian numerals, a base of 10 with the digits 0 through 9, and ultimately any number can be made by a combination of those numbers. Kind of like the Phoenician alphabet, the Indian numeral system and the decimal system will change mathematics forever. It's very adaptable to any kind of math, whether it be dealing with really tiny numbers with the decimals or dealing with really large numbers with just the numerals. Pierre-Simon Laplace, a French mathematician in the early 1800s, said this: "It is India that gave us the ingenious method of expressing all numbers by the means of 10 symbols, a profound and important idea which appears so simple to us now that we ignore its true merit. But its very simplicity, the great ease which it has lent to all computations, puts our arithmetic in the first rank of useful inventions, and we shall appreciate the grandeur of this achievement when we remember that it escaped the genius of Archimedes and Apollonius two of the greatest minds produced by antiquity in mathematics. They were the ancient Greek mathematicians. They did not have the Indian numerals. It will be invented instead later by the Gupta Indian mathematicians. Just think, folks, if you had to do math using Roman numerals instead of the 10 digits that you use. The Gupta mathematicians developed those numbers that we use today. Like I say, they're sometimes referred to as Arabic numerals, but they really are from India. The reason sometimes we refer to them as Arabic numerals is because the Arab world will adopt and adapt these numerals, and then they will spread them westward along trade routes with their interaction that they have with the Western world. So the West gets them from the Arabian Peninsula, but the Arabian Peninsula got them from India. An ancient Indian mathematical manuscript was written on birch bark called the Bashkani manuscript. It was created sometime between 200 BC and 300 AD. The Bakshali manuscript, that's how it's pronounced, the Bakshali manuscript, is the oldest record of Hindu Arabic numerals. This also includes the invention of the concept of zero. Medicine was also highly advanced. It continued to be advanced throughout the Gupta Empire. They had started the process in the Mauryan Empire. It will continue in the Gupta Empire later on. They even went so far as to start to practice setting broken bones when they were broken, to set the bone to help it heal. They did facial surgery, and they even developed a vaccine for the earliest version of smallpox. Rulers, as I said, were Hindu. The Gupta rulers were Hindu, but they did tolerate all faiths. Hinduism ultimately evolved during this process by adopting and adapting many elements of Buddhism to its own religion. So Hinduism is a religion that continues to grow and evolve and shift and change as we move through the centuries. Cultural diffusion, folks. Hinduism became ultimately a unifying force in the Gupta Empire, just as Buddhism had been earlier in the Mauryan Empire. But Buddhism will start to decrease in India during this time period, and instead the growth of Buddhism moves into other places like China. The Gupta emperors built massive stone Hindu temples and large dome-shaped shrines called stupas for the remains of holy figures to be housed in. Highly decorated ornamental decoration throughout these. You look here, you see how beautiful these stone temples are, these Hindu temples are. There's a stupa there. By 480, the Gupta Empire in India, northern India, collapsed, following a massive invasion by the Huns. The Huns again. So the Huns had brought some disorder to Han China, and now, of course, they bring disorder to the Gupta Empire in India. Now let's talk a little bit about trade networks on the Silk Roads and the Indian Ocean. The Silk Road first. The origin of the Silk Road. The Silk Road is named after China's famed silk trade, and it was the main overland connection between the East and the West in the ancient world, especially during the classical period. The Silk Road will eventually even grow. It was actually a series of roads rather than a single trade route. It expands as we move into the post-classical period and into the Middle Ages as well. By 200 BC, the Han Dynasty developed a series of caravan paths across Central Asia, connecting some earlier trade routes that had started under the Qin Dynasty. And eventually they did this so they could collect tribute from the conquered peoples and to improve trade. By 139 BC, Han Emperor Wu began a 10-year expedition to bring Central Asia under Chinese control and to ward off the nomadic Huns. All of these things will help to build and spread the Silk Roads ultimately. The Chinese had hoped to increase trade by controlling these caravan paths, especially trading for horses with the nomadic people in Central Asian steppe region. Between 100 BC and 100 AD or CE, despite several conflicts, the Chinese never really gained full control of what will be known as the Silk Road. These conflicts will interrupt trade. Merchants were unwilling to risk their goods and lives to trade on this road while these tensions continued. We also see on the Silk Roads the spread of agricultural innovations in China, spreading westward on these trade routes. So no one nation having complete control over the Silk Roads at any given time during this classical period, but all still using it. The Silk Road helped to facilitate the spread of agricultural technologies within China, some of which we talked about in the Han Dynasty period. The powered trip hammer was used to pound, separate, and polish grain. This was work that was usually done by hand, and it made the harvesting of crops much more fast. The square pallet chain pump channeled water to higher elevations to fill canal systems, to irrigate fields that might be on a hill or at higher elevations. This would be powered by a water wheel or an ox. This allowed for more terrace farming to be done throughout China in the mountainous areas of China. These new farming techniques allowed the Chinese to produce 2 rice crops a year and to use oxen to plow those fields. A Chinese granary along the Silk Road used during the Han period is viewed here. The sharing of these farming technologies and techniques along the Silk Road allowed China to become a major agricultural producer in the world. Now let's talk about the extent of the Silk Road. There's the Han Empire. By 100 AD or CE, the Han had expanded the empire into Central Asia. They had access to herds of horses, and the stirrups that had been invented by the nomads living to the north that they got the horses from helped with that. By the way, these people are the Mongols. We'll talk more about them later. The Silk Road ran from western China across Central Asia to cities of the Persian empires, and even had connections to the Roman Empire and northern Africa. That is an extensive trade network. The Silk Road spanned about 4,000 miles, but most merchants never traversed the entire length of it. Here's the city of Jaisalmer in India, a popular Silk Road stop. The Silk Road was actually, like I said, a series of roads, but with common stops along the way. And these common stops ultimately became trade centers where lots of trade would be done, and they connected the Silk Road. Both camels and horses were used as pack animals for the caravans that traveled along the Silk Roads. Pastoral nomads of Central Asia provided the animals to transport goods and the food and drink for caravan parties. That became the business of those pastoral nomads, like the Mongols. For periodic payments by merchants and government officials, the nomads protected caravans from bandits. The East exchanged silk, tea, spices, horses, fruits, rice, ceramics or china, and paper. The West traded grain, nuts, fruits, artwork, luxury goods, and gold. Busy marketplaces and towns along the Silk Road saw a blending of cultural traditions due to the travelers who were doing their trade. This cultural diffusion also was a blending of ideas and technologies along with those cultural traditions. So the Silk Road in and of itself can be viewed as a vehicle for cultural diffusion. We can see this also by looking at what happened with religion. Buddhism was introduced to China from India along the Silk Road, and will take such a strong hold in China that it eventually becomes the main religion in China, even as it fades from being a dominant religion in India by the time we get to the Gupta period. The spread of disease is also something we have to consider when we look at the Silk Road. Not only do we have cultural diffusion, exchange of ideas, exchange of technology, exchange of goods, but we also have the exchange of pathogens. Along with the diffusion of cultures, ideas, religions, the Silk Road saw the spread of deadly diseases, especially as we move into the post-classical or medieval period of history. Measles, smallpox, and even the dreaded bubonic plague in the late Middle Ages. Between 100 and 600 AD or CE, the end of the classical period, 1/4 to 1/2 of the Chinese population had died from diseases that were spread along the Silk Road. This greatly weakens the Han Dynasty and may be one of the major factors as to why the Han Dynasty came to an end. The weakening of the Han Dynasty was not just weak rulers, it was also illness that was being brought to China, or that was being spread throughout China, I should say, along these Silk Roads. The Roman and Gupta empires experienced similar population losses from diseases spread along the Silk Road. We'll talk more about how this happens in the Roman Empire when we get to that unit. By 540 AD, the bubonic plague started along the Silk Road in Central Asia and spread into the Persian Empire and the Byzantine Empire. This is one of the earlier waves of the bubonic plague. It is not the big wave that we will see in the 1300s in the late Middle Ages. However, it will be the same illness. We'll talk more about that towards the end of the course. These are areas we see plague spreading westward along the Silk Roads. The Byzantine Empire, the Byzantine people, called it Justinian's plague. Justinian was one of their major emperors in the 500s AD because it spread throughout the Mediterranean and North Africa during his reign, wreaking havoc, causing disruption of trade, disruption of the economy, as well as reducing the population. Now let's talk a little bit about the decline of the Silk Road. Even though this will not happen until later periods, it's a good time to talk about it now since we're still talking about the Silk Road. The Han Dynasty used its military to try to protect their parts of the Silk Road, allowing goods to move more safely and efficiently across the roads. But the dynasty ultimately collapsed in 220 CE or AD. During the ensuing period of turmoil in China with the fall of the Han Dynasty, the caravans on the Silk Road no longer had Chinese military protection, and ultimately trade will decline during that period. By 600 AD, the Tang Dynasty emerged in China, and the Silk Road again started to flourish, having Tang military protection. The Indian Ocean trade routes are now what we're going to talk about. We'll talk more about the Silk Road as we move through different units in this course. Now we're going to talk some about the Indian Ocean trade routes. Origins of the Indian Ocean trade routes. About 200 BC, trade lanes of Western Indian Ocean developed at the same time as the Silk Road. The Indian Ocean trade routes were initially localized, like the Silk Road was, and boats remained close to the shore, but that will change over time. Maritime trade routes are less vulnerable to political conflicts than the Silk Road overland trade routes. They're more secure, and the boats can carry larger quantities of goods. However, the sailors had to learn to navigate and maneuver throughout the monsoons, those winds that blew across the Indian Ocean. So they had to learn how to navigate through the monsoons as well. By about 100 AD, numerous ports all along the Indian Ocean belonged to a single trade route known as the Indian Ocean trade route. You can see all the little dots all around that area. The trade route, the Indian Ocean trade route, connected Southeast Asia, Southwest Asia, China, East Africa, and India. It's a huge sea network. The old pattern of ships hugging the coasts ultimately would be replaced by a major maritime route spanning the entirety of the Indian Ocean from east to west. Between 100 BC and 100 AD, interruptions in trade along the Silk Road led many merchants in East Asia and India to try their hand at the Indian Ocean trade routes, thinking they might be safer. The Indian Ocean was safer for exchanging goods with Western Asia and with folks living in the Mediterranean. The Roman Empire provided stability for shipping throughout the areas that they controlled, and that ultimately made it easier to trade along the Indian Ocean trade network. You can see a Roman coin that was found in India, showing that the trade between the Roman Empire and India happened through this trade network. Innovations in maritime technology and knowledge made all of this possible. The Chinese governor of Canton said, according to the government regulations concerning seagoing ships, the larger ones can carry several hundred men, and the smaller ones may have more than 100 men on board. The ship's pilots are acquainted with the configuration of the coasts. At night, they steer by the stars, and in the daytime by the sun. In dark weather, they look at the south-pointing needle. They also use a line 100 feet long with a hook at the end, which they let down to take samples of mud from the sea bottom. By its appearance and smell, they can determine their whereabouts. Some of these innovations, of course, will make maritime travel a lot easier. That needle is part of what will eventually become a compass, the magnetic needle. So these things will make the seafaring a lot easier and safer. Shipyards along the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea and the southern Arabian coastline were able to start constructing larger ships as trade grew on the Indian Ocean. Shipbuilders in the Red Sea replaced the square sails with triangular lateen sails. These were better suited to the high winds of the open ocean and allowed a ship to travel using these winds to their advantage rather than these winds ripping their sails apart and causing the ship to capsize. Ships became faster and more maneuverable as the trip from India to Arabia was cut from 4 months to 40 days. By 100 AD or CE, Sailors had become familiar with the monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean and were able to maneuver with them or around them. Monsoon winds blow off the east coast of Africa between April and October and then reverse the other half of the year. So they'd make sure they planned their trips accordingly so they could use the winds to their advantage rather than trying to sail against them. Understanding monsoon winds allowed sailors to complete a round-trip journey of the Indian Ocean in just a year. Expansion of the Indian Ocean trade routes. Expansion of the Indian Ocean trade route with maritime innovations like the new sails and like the magnetic needle, making a compass, as well as other things, had a huge impact on trans-regional trade. The Romans expanded their shipping down the Red Sea and into the Indian Ocean. The Romans also entered trade agreements with Indian states, establishing pricing guidelines and the protection of ships. We'll talk some more about this with the Romans when we get to the Roman Empire. The Romans' gold flowed into Asia as a result, as demand for luxury goods like spices, silk, ceramics, ivory increased in the Roman Empire. So again, this allows for more exchange of goods, but also exchange of ideas and cultural diffusion between the East and the West. Indian ports had a system of port commissions led by a director of trade that established prices, collected taxes, and also charged for warehouse rentals along the Indian coastline. They would be warehouses for trade goods. India expanded trade with Southeast Asia, China, and Africa to meet the increasing demand for goods to support India's growing population. The southern coastal provinces of China benefited from Indian Ocean trade. The Arabian frankincense, African ivory, both were in high demand by this point, by the end of the classical period, moving into the post-classical period. Frankincense, an aromatic tree resin. Ivory, of course, from Africa. Southeast Asian empires came and went based on the control of trade in this region for centuries. By 200 AD, the huge Indian Ocean trade network led to the creation of interdependent Indian Ocean region. This is a 21st century Silk Road and Indian Ocean trade route. Does it still exist today? China has actually begun the construction of the Silk Road economic belt and the 21st century maritime Silk Road, trying to strengthen cooperation with the countries involved. As you see here, one route is called the String of Pearls route, and the other route that you see there are the oil shipping lanes. So we can connect it to our lives today.